Welcome to Sarat Samvad, an initiative from Border Studies in South Asia. Now, our guest for today is Dr. Azmery Ferdoush. Now, Dr. Azmery is a postdoctoral researcher in geography at the University of Oulu in Finland. He is currently working on a project to study the way man-made ideas of borders and bounded spaces affect human mobility and vice versa in the Arctic region. He has received his Ph.D. in geography and environment from the University of Hawaii in the United States, where he studied the border enclaves in India and Bangladesh. He has also taught at the University of Hawaii and also at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh as a lecturer. Now he has published several articles in relation to the India-Bangladesh borderland region, which we would be discussing over the course of this interaction. In addition, Dr. Azmeary has also co-edited the famous book, Borders and Mobility in South Asia and Beyond, and also co-authored a chapter on post-exchange experiences of the residents of former India-Bangladesh border enclaves in the book titled Handbook of Asian Borderlands. Now, thank you, Dr. Azmeary, for giving us this time. And our first question for you is that you have extensively worked and published about the former border enclaves that existed between India and Bangladesh. Now, this would be a two-part question. Can you briefly explain to us the history of the India-Bangladesh border enclaves, in particular your demonstration of them being symbolic spaces within the nationalistic discourse of post-colonial South Asia? And the second question is that you have in your upcoming paper argued that the active role of both countries in incorporating these border enclaves as an act of sovereign atonement. Can you please elaborate on this conceptualization further?
Yeah, thank you. Before I start my answers, I really want to thank you and the Border Studies Initiative for having me. This is a great honor to be a part of this initiative. And now, getting back to the question, the first question about symbolic spaces, when it goes back a little when I started my PhD. I started my PhD in 2015 January, and at that time the enclaves were not exchanged. They were still part of India and part of Bangladesh. And my plan was to study the experience of statelessness of the enclave people. But what happened in July of 2015, these enclaves got exchanged. So I had to also change my plan according to the exchange. And it was actually a great opportunity for me to study the enclaves after they were exchanged, because it really doesn't happen that much. It's not a very common phenomenon in modern history of the state. So the first question I was thinking, okay, why these enclaves were exchanged when they were exchanged? That is, why did it take like almost 7 decades to finally exchange, although India and Pakistan signed a treaty and then India and Bangladesh signed a treaty, but it took almost 70 years to execute that exchange. And why in 2015 when BJP was in power in India, because BJP has been historically the party that has opposed enclave exchange from the India side. So I started to look at the history of these enclaves, and going briefly to this history of these enclaves, they came into being in 1713 as a result of a treaty between the Mughal Empire and the Kuchbehar king. But these enclaves were not a problem, or at least these were not international enclaves, and these did not pose any problem for the enclave people until 1947, when the Indian subcontinent was divided between Pakistan and India. And as a result of that division and some sloppy work in mapping, these enclaves ended up being on the other side of the border. That means Pakistani enclaves were in India and Indian enclaves were in Pakistan. So this was the first time these enclaves became international enclave. They were divided by an international border between India and Pakistan, and India and Pakistan started a passport and visa system in 1952, which eventually disconnected these enclaves from their home country. And then, as a result of different historical events in 1965, the brief war between India, Pakistan, and then the birth of Bangladesh in 1971, and changes in South Asian geopolitics, these enclaves and enclave people became totally cut off from their home countries. Now, again, going back to this 1947, 1958 was the first time that at that time Pakistan and India signed a treaty to exchange these enclaves in 1958, which is famously known as Nehru-Noon Agreement. But this agreement was heavily criticized both in India and Pakistan, and there were lawsuits filed against it in India. And by the time these lawsuits were resolved, it was 1970, and in 1971, Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan until 1971, was not part of East Pakistan, part of Pakistan anymore, because there was this Bangladesh and Pakistan, and eventually Bangladesh gained independence and became an independent country. So that treaty signed in 1958 was not valid anymore. But Bangladesh has had a very historically friendly relationship with India, and India had a huge role in Bangladesh's independence. So Bangladesh signed another treaty in 1974 to exchange the enclaves. But then again in 1975, with the assassination of the first prime minister of the country, Sheikh Mujib, and changes in political scenarios in India as well, these enclave exchanges are very complicated, and enclaves actually gained a more contradictory status both in Indian and Pakistan, both in Indian and Bangladeshi nationalistic rhetorics. To give some examples, these enclave land and enclave people were very insignificant compared to the total land and population both in Bangladesh and India. So these countries, the home states, were never really very careful or very passionate about these people on the ground, but they were very passionate about these territories that were on the other side of the border and were still part of the state territory. So as a result of that unique territorial oddity, if we can say that, these enclaves gained very a significant status in both Bangladesh and India, in the sense that politicians took advantage of these territories and turned them into hot debates or topic of hot debates in nationalistic discourses. For example, the enclaves of Bangladesh that were in India were depicted in Bangladesh as places where fellow Bangladeshi citizens are suffering because the unfriendly neighbor India is not allowing the state of Bangladesh to go and help its citizens. At the same time, the enclaves of India inside Bangladesh and people living in there were depicted as illegals and intruders and a host of smugglers and host of criminals living inside the state territory who do not belong to that country. Same way in India too. And BJP historically has been more opposed or more vocal about these enclave and enclave people. So as a result of that, scholars who studied enclaves, they have depicted these enclaves as sensitive space, saying that they have been, for Jason Kahns, called them sensitive space. And he claims that these enclaves gained a very significant status in the nationalistic rhetorics, but the states never really cared about the people on the ground. And at the same time, if we draw on Shankaran Krishna's famous work on cartographic anxiety, they also became the sources for cartographic anxiety both in Bangladesh and India. Now, fast forward from 1974 to 2000s, between this time, both India and Bangladesh went through some significant political changes in their domestic arena. For example, in Bangladesh, the regime of Jia and Ershad government turned the Bangladesh state more into an Islamic state rather than a secular state. And they changed their, let's say, international ties more from India and Soviet Russia to more towards the Islamic Islamic countries or Islamic members of Islamic organizations like OIC. At the same time, in India, there was we could see that there was a clear uprise in the Hinduism and Hindu nationalistic rhetoric in India as well. So both these countries needed the other on which these sentiments would be projected on. So for Bangladesh, bringing out these Islamic sentiments, India became this other. And from India, Bangladesh became this other of host of fundamental Islamic sentiments. So within that rhetoric, again, enclaves became very significant. Then these enclaves were part of this entire debate that these politicians were making. Now, those to a huge extent turned these enclaves as spaces, as sensitive spaces. Now, fast forward again to 2009 when Azmeary came into power, and at the same time, during almost the same time, Congress came into power in India. Both these countries took initiative, because these are the two parties that has historically been the most friendly parties between India and Bangladesh. So they took the initiative again to start this friendly bilateral relationship. And as a part of that, India and Bangladesh decided to exchange these enclaves, solve the border disputes, and India promised Bangladesh a joint river water sharing, especially in the river Tista. And 2011, the then Indian president Manmohan Singh visited Bangladesh, and he was supposed to sign this treaty between Bangladesh and India for this joint river water agreement in Tista and solving border disputes. And in exchange, Bangladesh was also giving or Bangladesh was also complying to lots of demands that India had. For example, an special economic zone, then transit through the Bangladeshi territory towards Indian states in east, then letting Bangladesh's seaport for Indian vessels to use. So Bangladesh kept its promise, but in 2011, when Manmohan Singh was supposed to sign the treaty, the Chief Minister of West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee, opposed both the exchange of the enclaves as well as water sharing in Tista. So no treaty was signed in 2011, although India promised that. And then it got prolonged, and instead of treaty, only a protocol was signed in 2011. So India was already in a pressure to give something to Bangladesh. And Bangladesh, especially the Azmery government, was also in a pressure inside the country or from the domestic politicians to show something that, okay, our friendly relationship with India has yielded something for the country. But again, by within these debates and within these prolonging negotiations, another election came by both India and Bangladesh. Azmery won the election in 2014 and then formed the government. But on the other side, it was Narendra Modi and BJP government who got elected and formed the government. That's where the surprise comes in, because the BJP government has been, as I mentioned earlier, historically the opposing party to enclave exchange. But Narendra Modi had his policies like the look-east policy, neighborhood first policy, and he started with an impression of having a good relationship with the neighbors first. So Modi visited Bangladesh, and finally a treaty was signed between Bangladesh and India. Modi government somehow managed to convince the Chief Minister of West Bengal, and the Chief Minister of West Bengal finally agreed to the exchange of the enclaves, but not to the water sharing. And between this water sharing and enclave exchange, I would say it was easier for Modi government to press about the enclave exchange rather than water sharing. And that is why enclave exchange was finally executed in 2015 when Narendra Modi visited Bangladesh and signed the treaty. Now, when enclaves were exchanged, these enclaves, instead of being depicted as this sensitive space or these spaces of national sufferings or national territories or significant national territories that are being lost, this time when the treaty was signed was depicted as symbols of friendship, symbols of cooperation, symbols of good neighborliness. And so this time, these became symbolic spaces of friendship and cooperation. That's what I argue in my article. So what I would say in the broad picture, these enclaves have always been played as a pawn in the broader geopolitical aspects of Bangladesh and India, and they were used as these symbolic spaces, sometimes symbols of friendship, sometimes symbols of anonymity, but they were symbolic spaces rather than really practically significant space in that sense, because they did not have any practical economic value neither to these countries, because they were really small spaces. They were not generating a lot of taxes. They were not host of natural resources or anything. So they had always been given this extra significance or symbolic significance to them, even when they were exchanged and when they were existent. That's why I call them symbolic spaces, going through how historically these enclaves have gone through the evolution of from their birth to their exchange. And now coming back to the second part of the question, this idea of sovereign atonement came to me when I was doing my fieldwork in these enclaves in Bangladesh. So I must first mention that I did not do any field work in India or in the enclaves inside India, because I was not allowed a visa to go in India to do that. So whatever I'm speaking about these enclave people and the situation on the ground, I'm speaking from the Bangladesh side. I'm not claiming it to be true or equally applicable to India side. So when I was conducting my fieldwork after the enclaves were exchanged, I visited these enclaves. I was there almost for a year, and I saw that these enclave people were treated in a very unique way. My question when I was preparing to go to the field is that, okay, how does the state of Bangladesh treat the same population when the same population that it once excluded and which were not considered being a part of the state, and they were not recognized as citizens? Now, how does the same state or the same government, or to be very specific, the term that I use in the article is the sovereign, because it has been, these enclaves have been analyzed as being these victims of sovereign violence, drawing on Agambenian framework, but not being protected by the sovereign. So my question was, how does the same sovereign include the same population which once it excluded? And my assumption was that it was not going to, this recognition by the state, by the sovereign, was not going to make a significant difference in their lives. But when I was in the field, I saw that there were many unique ways that the state was incorporating these citizens, these new citizens. For example, their land was being registered, because this enclave land was never registered in the host state's record. Now, one of the biggest initiatives that the state took was to make this land legible, or to register this land and bring them under state legibility. And this would be, I would say, the prime example of what I call sovereign atonement, is that Bangladesh state took a special measure to register these lands. They did not use the already existing land registration system. They rather formed a special task force, special committee to register these enclave lands, which was quicker, which was also very user-friendly. And there are other examples, like these enclaves were connected to the national power grid very quickly. Roads were being built to connect these enclaves to the rest of the country. So I was asking people, okay, what's happening? I was asking the state officials who were in charge of those enclaves, and they said, yeah, we have this instruction from the government to help these enclave people as much as we can and to prioritize them. Now, I was wondering, okay, is there any formal document to show that, okay, the government has this formal proclamation to help these enclave people especially? But there was no formal document like that. These were all informal instructions passed from the top of the hierarchy to the ground level officials. And they were just following those instructions and prioritizing enclave people and these services to them. But at the same time, these services were not extended to their neighbors who have been living there as regular Bangladeshi citizens. Now, these special arrangements are unique ways of helping or incorporating these people is the process that I call sovereign atonement. Now, when I use the term sovereign atonement, it gives an impression that it was this correction from the violence or the state or the correction that the sorry state wanted to make because it once excluded these people or inflicted violence. But definitely not. These are not this correction from the sovereign state or for its violence. Rather, what I argue is that these are just another state-making technology, especially territory-making technology. So these key of how to understand the role of the sovereign to incorporate these people, I argue, lies in the primacy of territory in post-colonial South Asia. Again, these were symbolic spaces. So my explanation to this sovereign atonement or this particular response from the sovereign was based on the reading of territory. And I have two different explanations on that, but both of them are related to territory. One is that their historically amplified status as symbolic spaces or sensitive space warranted an attention from the state, from the international media. So the state had to respond to that. And as a result of that, they had this special response to these newly exchanged territories that was handed back to the state. And they had to do something to make those territories legible to the state or make part of the state. So that came from the historically amplified status of this territory or these territories being symbolic spaces. And the second is, I argue that territory and citizenship was used as technologies of territory making. So drawing on Stuart Eldon's theory of or idea of territory, that territory is the technology of measuring land and terrain, I argue here is that in this case at least, citizenship was also used as a technology of territory making in the way that these people were recognized as citizens for the first time and their land and those territories were recognized as state territories and their ownership to those land was for the first time formally recognized by the state. And at the same time, as I mentioned, land registration system was also in place just to help these people to register their land, to make those land legible. So that at the same time served the purpose for the state to make this land legible, and on the other hand for the citizens to practice their citizenship rights on those territories, which in the broader picture I argue work as the technology of territory making from the ground up. So to sum up this, I would say that this particular response from the sovereign to help these people and to extend these unique privileges or unique opportunities to these enclave people in Bangladesh was mostly a byproduct of state and territory making in post-colonial South Asia.
Thank you for this answer. Your articulation of the history of the Indio-Bangladesh border enclaves is, I believe, among one of the most lucidly explained that may exist online, and especially the chronological sequencing of the explanation. And for the second part, the concept of sovereign atonement is actually quite unique, and it's a unique way of understanding actions of post-colonial South Asian countries.
Thank you.
Now, second question for you. is that you have shown in your work that when both India and Bangladesh exchanged their border enclaves in 2015, nearly 98% of the 55,000 enclave residents decided to stay where they were and opted for a change in their citizenship. You have in your work presented a framework to demonstrate how through concepts of acts of belonging can be productively used to explain their choice of citizenship. Can you please elaborate us on this thought process of border enclave residents?
Yeah, that is a great question, and that was one of the most significant question I was also grappling with when I was doing my field work. Because if we look at the government expectations during that time or just before the exchange, that both countries actually expected, especially India expected a lot of people from Bangladesh to move to India because they were given the opportunity or the choice um, to pick up or to opt for any country's citizenship. And especially India expected that a lot of people from Bangladesh side or the enclaves inside Bangladesh would opt to move to India. And they had a special budget allocated for that. But to the surprise of the both countries or both governments, only I would say finally there were only 930 people from Bangladesh who decided to move to India, and none of them decided to move to Bangladesh from India side. So I was wondering how to explain their choice of citizenship. How do I explain why these many people going against the conventional wisdom that we always hear, that okay, India has these economic pull factors, given any opportunity, these poor people from Bangladesh would always migrate to India. But that did not happen, at least in the case of the enclave residents. So I was wondering how to explain that. And as I was talking to these people, one of the questions that I always ask them is, why did they choose to stay in Bangladesh, or why did they choose to move to India? Now, as I developed my thoughts, this idea developed that okay, actually it can be explained through the lens of belonging. And that's when this idea of acts of belonging developed. And by acts of belonging, I refer both the acts and the actions by which these people, the enclave people, express their belonging to a certain space or to a certain country. So, for example, this could be marrying someone from the other side, or to the mainland Bangladesh, or to the mainland country of India, and then moving there or bringing them inside the enclave, having setting up a shop somewhere in the mainland, or setting or buying a land. So these are all acts of belonging by which they expressed where they belong, or at least where they think they belong. Now, again, I was wondering, okay, then acts of belonging are the key to our understanding, but how do we understand their acts of belonging? Why these acts of belonging, or why these acts were mostly or predominantly intended towards setting up in the host country instead of moving to the home country, which they were formerly part of. And then I came up with this framework that I bring in the idea of social memory, then regional identity and spatial socialization to explain their acts of belonging. Now, I say that I do, at least to explain the acts of belonging, is that because of their social memory and regional identity, they were spatially socialized to the host country rather than to the home country. And the reason behind that is that they have been living in those enclaves for the last 7 decades, and they are now second or third generation living in those enclaves. So although formally they were part of the country that is on the other side of the border, most of them have never been to that country, and most of them don't know much about that country, but they were born and brought up in the host country. So all their memories were of the country that were born and brought up, which are the host countries. So for generations, they developed this memory of where they belong or where they were born was the host country. At the same time, the different sites of memory that we know that different sites of memory that are erected by the state or the powerful discourses that tells you what your social memory is. For example, at least in Bangladesh side, the Shohid Minar is a site of memory that always tells you that, okay, this is a significant national memory that you gotta know that people laid their lives for this language. So because these enclave people were born and raised in the host country, and by host country this time I'm meaning in Bangladesh, their sites of memory, their social memory were all mostly influenced by the host country's memory. At the same time, again, because they were born and raised and they have been living in for generations, their regional identity, the identity that they developed through their social memory, through their interaction to their neighbors, to the rest of the society, was also the regional identity of the space that they were staying, and that is the space or the region of the host country. So they had developed this regional identity. If we look at the literature of regional geography, we would see that regional identity is a huge factor for people to develop their own national identity or their own identity. So again, by the same logic, because they have been born and brought up mostly in the host state, their regional identity was also the identity of the host state. And their those regional institutions, the structure of expectations, those are all dominantly influenced by the host state. So as a result, their regional identity and their social memory, with those interactions of their identity and social memory, they were spatially socialized to the host state, to the state that, again, their memory has been developed, their identity has been developed. So that is, again, enclaves being in the host country. So for this side, or for the Bangladesh side, it was the enclave people having the social memory of Bangladesh and having the regional identity of northern Bangladesh, or the region that those enclaves were. So they were specially socialized to northern Bangladesh. And they have their, if you visit those enclaves, it is very obvious that they have this specific way of talking, specific way of communicating, which is very typical to northern Bangladesh. And I would say same would apply to the other side, where these people again were born and raised with social memory and regional identity of India or West Bengal. They developed that identity, and that's why they were specially socialized to the state of India instead of socialized to the home state. Now, because of social memory, their regional identity, they were already specially socialized, but they were their socialization, their spatial socialization, their identity, their memory were not formally recognized by the host state, because they were not part of the host state, again, because these were enclaves. Now, when in 2015 they were finally recognized by the host state and were accepted as the territory of the host state, these people, for them the choice was pretty clear. Like they already had this identity developed that was finally accepted or recognized by the state. That is why almost 98% of them opted to stay where they were, because they had already been specialized. The only thing that was waiting for them was to be recognized by the state. And that's what happened in 2015. And that's why I'd say these 98% of the people decided to stay where they were, and eventually their special socialization also nationally socialized them. So when it came to the choice of citizenship, the moment when they were choosing the citizenship, for most of them it was a pretty clear, straightforward choice to decide to stay where they were, because they had already been socialized, especially socialized. Their memories have been of that country, of that region. Their identity has been of that region, and they have been living there for generations. So again, going against the conventional wisdom of economic pull factor, because of acts of belonging, I argue, because of their social memory, because of their regional identity, they decided to stay where they were and opted for the citizenship of the host country rather than the home country.
Thank you for that answer. Now, our next question for you is that you have undertaken extensive ethnographic fieldwork in the Bangladesh borderland, and based on this experience, you have touched on several aspects in your paper. Firstly, the concerns for a researcher using his social capital to gain access to borderland population. Secondly, that forcing gender balance does not necessarily add value to the research, but rather makes it more challenging to access the same population for further research. And lastly, that being from the same region with a similar background does not make the researcher an insider. Rather, positionality becomes more fluid between an insider and outsider, both and sometimes none. Can you briefly explain these three aspects that you have highlighted in your paper?
Sure, and thank you for the question. It is actually one of the most favorite part when it from personally for me, because I I didn't really have any plan to write this paper when I started writing my dissertation, but when I was reflecting back, when I was writing the methodology section of my dissertation, I thought, yeah, I really had some really interesting encounters in the field, which are not taught in a methods class. I had to take two different methods class before I went to the field, and these are incidents that you are not trained as an ethnographer, or it is hard to train you as an ethnographer in the class for these kind of interactions and these kind of incidents. So I thought, yeah, why not write about it? And I focused on these three or four particular issues in that paper. The first one is, of course, as you mentioned, using social capital to gain access. Now, for me, gaining access to the enclave people or the borderland population was not really difficult. They were rather really interested to talk to me, and they were more curious. But it was a challenge when I was trying to interview the state officials, especially mid and higher level state officials. Now, they were really helpful to help me set up, to help me find a place to stay in that enclave, and then introducing me to the local leaders, enclave leaders, enclave population. But in most of the cases, when I was asking them questions, or I asked for formal interviews with them about the enclave and enclave matters, uh, surprisingly, they were very reluctant to answer my questions. And in many cases, they, although not directly said no, but they were very elusive when it came to interview them. For example, uh, I mentioned one of the UNOs and one of the chairmen in one of the upazilas when I was trying to get access and I was trying to interview them. They were really helpful at the first phase when I was introduced to them. I was setting up in the enclave and started my field work. But when I asked them for an interview, they did not say no on my face, but every time they gave me a time to go and talk to them, I would not find them. Either they would not be in the office, they would tell me that they're busy and to come back sometimes later. So it was getting very frustrating, and it was repetitive in many cases, especially again, as I mentioned, the mid and higher level bureaucratic officers. For some reason, they were not comfortable uh, on being recorded or on an interview, and I assume that this is because of this apparent sensitivity of the topic, that it is a border issue and it is an enclave issue, and talking about borders is not something that they were comfortable. But at the same time, again, going back to my training in the classes, I was also being very anxious that, okay, what happens if I can't interview these people? What happens to my project? I'll not have a full picture. So I was using my social capital, that I was trying to find out, okay, who I know that I can ask them to tell them to give me an interview, which is, I think, is a very common phenomenon in South Asia. Now, that helped me, of course. I was most of the times able to find someone to vouch for me, and that eventually led to a formal interview. But those interviews, I realized that were not as productive or as spontaneous as the other interviews where I did not have to push for it. Because those interviews, they agreed, maybe because of my social capital, because of my connection. But at the same time, they were very on the surface. They were also very uh, um, what should I say, evasive when it came to answering questions, and also they were intentionally changing the conversation to something else. So I thought, okay, maybe using social capital all the time to get an interview is not a good idea, and I should probably talk about my experience. So I was wondering, what does an ethnographer do in that situation? And to be honest, at least from my perspective, there is no definite answer to that. It totally depends on that situation and on the call of the ethnographer at that time. Now coming to the second one, again, is the gender issue, which again I, or at least in the methods class, that you are taught, ideally you should have a gender balance in your participants. Now in South Asia, especially rural South Asia, if you being a male, going to someone else's house, not knowing them, and asking for the women in that house, and then just start asking her question, or just to have the conversation, is not something that is, I would say, accepted in that sense, or expected. Now, if I had pushed for it, probably I could have, yes, had some interviews with some more women than I had. But again, at the same time, that would definitely leave a negative impression about the researcher. For me, or anyone who wants to, or who has a plan to go and do a similar kind of research with the same population, because that would leave a bad impression of myself with that population, which I also thought, or I also found when I was talking to them. They said, like, yeah, many researchers come and go. When we talk to them, they are very nice, and then they just forget about us, and they do not keep any connection. So I already found that there was already this prevalent negative idea about the researchers, and I definitely did not want to leave one more there. So I had to just be happy with the women, or the female respondents or female participants in my research, who were more willing to do it, and most of them were, of course, either government officials or public figures like political leaders. So I thought, like, okay, I definitely need to talk about these, because I had to justify why I did not have this so-called gender balance in my research participants. Then the third part is this concept of same background, and this comes, I would say, from the history of ethnography, where in the classical ethnography, fathers like classical anthropologists like Malinowski would go and stay for 12, 18 years with the savages, and become a part of them, to know them well. But that has definitely changed, and as the critical ethnographer, especially from the late, from the 60s and 70s with the advent of post-structuralism, they agree that it is not possible to just be one of them, even if you are from the same region, let alone if you're from a different culture, let alone if you're a white guy trying to be one of the uh, so-called savages. Now, for me, I come from the northern region of the country where all these enclaves are were situated. So I have the same regional dialect, that I can speak the same regional dialect. I connect with the same regional identities. I connect with the same regional phenomenon. And they also know, when every time you go, the first question they ask you is like, where are you from? And every time you say that, okay, I'm from this place, they kind of approve that okay, you are one of ours. But that definitely would not make me one of theirs. I was the one who was definitely the different one. Like among all of them, everyone would know that I am not one of them. Even although I was from the same region, I speak the same language, same dialect, and I grew up there. Now, what that made is that it made a very fluid identity for myself, which other ethnographers doing ethnography in the same region, having the same background, had said the same thing, that sometimes they become insider. As I said, when they hear that, okay, I'm from the same region, they accept me. That part or that moment, I feel like, okay, they accepted me as an insider just because I'm from the same, I have a kind of similar regional background and similar uh, identity. But when it comes to their daily lives, their experiences, I'm definitely not one of them, because I am definitely a class privileged Bangladeshi citizen who is studying in the US. For almost all of them, they have never been outside of the country. They had never the privilege to go in school, let alone universities. They definitely share the experience of statelessness, which I don't. So it does not make me one of them. So when it comes to that aspect or that point, then I'm definitely an outsider. And I could never, let's say, penetrate that outsider identity. And I don't think it is ever possible to do that, just because I cannot, or an ethnographer cannot change themselves and become just the other person with the participant community. So what I say, or what I um, when I reflect back, I'd say that, okay, yeah, sometimes I was an insider, sometimes I was an outsider, and sometimes because of being this both insider and outsider, I was none. And that made my positionality very fluid. I had to always negotiate that fine line between an insider and outsider when I was talking to my research participants and when I was introducing myself in different occasions or different social gatherings. So yeah, I would say I definitely, even if you're from South Asia, even if you're from the same region and studying the same population, you can't never be one of them just because of your positionality and individual identity.
Thank you for that answer. Now, our next and last question for you is, please share suggestions for young scholars intending to work on South Asian borders.
Sure. To be very clear, I'm a very young scholar as well. So I do not have the, let's say, the wisdom of telling someone what to do, but I can definitely share my thoughts and my experiences on working on South Asia, and for anyone who wants to do some research, especially ethnographic research in South Asia. First, I think South Asia being one of the biggest regions in the world and having the second most dense population or second most populated region in the world. It is interestingly understudied. Although, and within South Asia, I would say some countries are way more understudied than some other countries. For example, whenever I see academic interest, let alone irrespective of Western scholars or scholars from South Asia, most of them are very much aware of and interested in India. But when it comes to, let's say, smaller countries like Nepal or Bangladesh, I would say there are less academic interest. But these regions are not less happening, I would say. So from my perspective, I would say South Asia is a very fertile region for any kind of research, especially research on borders, just because of the history of the region. It is a comparatively new region which is still in making, where territorial identity and national identity are still being negotiated every day. So these are very productive places to study territory, state, nationalism, migration, forced migration, and recently with the exodus of Rohingya, of course, camps and refugees. Then the rhetoric and the debate about illegal migration, intruders, then belonging, citizenship, national identity. How does religion play a role in nationalism? And I would say any country in South Asia is a productive place to study that. Trafficking, for example, is another, and climate-induced movement, climate-induced refugee are another productive topic, I would say, to study in South Asia. Now, say that my advice, or at least what I feel being a young researcher myself, is that there are senior researchers, there are senior academics who are ready to help you. We just have to ask for it. And I have always found anyone that I have never met or don't know, but if I write them an email asking for any kind of suggestions or help or anything, I've always found them very helpful. And that's, I would say, my advice is that to be proactive and connect with the senior academics or anyone in that sense who are in the same field, to connect with them. And it gives a huge, it is a huge help to develop someone else's own academic works and career.
Now, thank you for that answer, Dr. Azmeary. Now, one thing that I would like to say, which I've said before, is that Dr. Azmeary's work has pioneered a unique identity for border studies within South Asia, and his work would be extremely helpful for those scholars that would be researching on South Asian borders, especially those scholars that may come up in the future. Now, thank you, Dr. Azmeary, for giving us this time and for this extremely informative session.